Okay. So I'm going to be talking about some work. I first want to preface that this is some work that was collected in 2014, 2 years before the election. But the topic of this talk is about how economic anxieties can undermine support for female but not male political candidates. And this is done in collaboration with Galen Bodenhausen, who's at Northwestern University. Since 1937, Gallup has asked people if they would support a woman for president, and they've asked this question every year since then. And this is a graph of what those results look like. So as you can see, in 1937, people were like, nah, I wouldn't vote for a woman for president. But over time, it's crossed somewhere in the 50s. And so today, support for a woman is almost universal. Almost everybody would say that they would vote for a woman for president. Of course, that might not be entirely true, given some of the other talks that we've seen. But there's this discrepancy between people's willingness to vote for women for these high positions of political leadership and what female representation actually looks like in Congress. So if you look at, this was the 2016 Congress, there were 104 women in Congress, and if you break that down, roughly 21 women in the US Senate and 83 in the US House. So this is incredibly disproportionate to the gender breakdown in the country. So we were curious, given this really high level of support, why there might be this discrepancy in actual female representation. And there's been a lot of research that looks at potential explanations for why, and I'm not discounting any of those, but the one that we wanted to really focus on is gender stereotypes. And the literature about how gender stereotypes affects women who are interested in running for political leadership is really quite mixed. There's some work that suggests that it disadvantages women. There's other work that suggests there's no effect of gender on people's willingness to vote or their evaluations of women. And then there's also some work that suggests that gender actually advantages women, and this particularly is true for Democratic women who might be running on stereotypically feminine issues, like healthcare. Given this sort of disparate set of findings, we thought that this suggests that there are moderators that might influence when and how gender stereotypes impact support for female candidates. So the influence of gender stereotypes is contextually based. Some earlier work in political science has shown that the stated support for women can be incredibly variable. So this is some work by Jennifer Lawless, who surveyed people in the early 90s, and similar to the graph that I showed at the beginning of the talk, she saw near universal willingness to support a female candidate for president. But then she surveyed people again after 9/11, when we had this major threat to physical safety and a terrorist threat, and she found that that willingness to support a female candidate dropped to 60%. So it suggests that when some of these contextual effects are salient, it can really change people's self-reported willingness to support female candidates. But what we were curious about is whether or not more psychological threats would have the same sort of effect. So we were curious whether economic instability differentially impacted male and female leaders. So you could think that economic instability might function in the same way as physical threats like domestic terrorism in general, but it's also possible that because there's no direct sort of threat to your personhood, that it might not really impact your support for what kind of leader you'd like to support. So looking sort of at the 2016 election, this is a map of how counties ran, and what I really want to particularly highlight is over here in the Midwest sort of Rust Belt region. You can see that Trump ran much more strongly in these areas relative to Mitt Romney than Hillary ran relative to Barack Obama, which is what the blue areas would show. And some of the headlines that explain this suggest that this is potentially why Trump won Rule America and was stronger where the economy is weaker, and that Rust Belt counties where the economy was much more shaky, nearly all voted for Trump. So the way that we tested this idea of whether economic instability differentially influenced male and female leaders was with using an MTurk study. We first asked participants for their demographics. We asked this at the beginning because we wanted to get their political affiliation, which was relevant for another task that they did later on. Then they did an article manipulation where they read about the economy as either stable or unstable. Then they completed a ostensibly unrelated political impression task, which I'll show you in a little bit, and then finally reported the rest of their demographics. We had 183 participants from MTurk. Again, we collected these data in 2014 before 2016 happened. Participants were typical of MTurk. Everyone is showing means of around 35. Mostly white, mostly men. And 61% self-identify as Democrats, 23% as Republicans, 16% as independents. So the article manipulation looked like this. We gave them an article that was supposedly written by somebody working for Bloomberg Businessweek that talked about how the U.S./world economy was entering a period of either sustained stability or instability, depending on condition. And then just peppered throughout the article manipulation were different sort of cues to ongoing stability or instability, such as the decisions can be made with confidence or cannot be made with confidence, given clear or unclear signals of how the economy is settled into stable or unstable patterns. After they read this article, they did just a manipulation check, I'll show you in a little bit, and then they did a political impression task, in which they were asked to evaluate an ad that looked something like this. So depending on condition, they either saw a woman named Monica or a man named Matthew. And we went for a political ad that was relatively impoverished because previous research has shown that gender is more likely to be used as a heuristic in low information contexts. And critically at the bottom, we matched this to whatever the participants said that they self-identified as. So if at the beginning they told us that they identified as a Democrat, they saw an ad that said Democrat for Senate. And finally, our dependent variables were an impression composite, things like I have a positive impression of this candidate, I see them as particularly credible, and also an electability composite, which got at their belief that the candidate could win a primary election or a general election. So people really believed our article manipulation. In the stable condition, they perceived the economy to be pretty stable, and in the unstable, they thought it was pretty unstable. Looking at our main DVs, so this is an impression composite on the y-axis. For male candidates, it really did not make a difference whether people read about a stable economy or an unstable economy. Support for this male candidate didn't really shift very much. For the female candidate, what we see is that although she starts off higher, sort of replicating the results that I showed at the very beginning from the public opinion poll, support for the female candidate decreased as a function of reading about an unstable economy. So what I want to highlight here is that it basically really demonstrates that support for female candidates is highly fickle and variable in a way that it's not for male candidates. The same effect emerges for the electability composite, where support for male candidates doesn't change as a function of perceived economic stability or instability, but it does for the female candidate in the exact same pattern. So in study one, what we take away from this is that support for female but not male candidates decline when people feel a sense of economic instability. And so in study two, we wanted to examine why. And additionally, we also wanted to examine whether there were any gender affinity effects. So oftentimes in political science, they talk about how women are more likely to vote for women. And so we were wondering if that would emerge. We didn't have the power to detect it in study one, so in study two, we collected twice the sample size. So study two proceeded in exactly the same fashion, where we first asked people about their demographics, gave them the same article manipulation, the same political impression task, but we swapped out the pictures to make sure that it was more generalizable. Reported the demographics again, and at the very end, we also included a number of policy items that were potential mediators of this effect. So the mediator items were something like this. We asked them to please rate the extent to which you believe the candidate you just saw is capable of handling healthcare, education, civil rights, economic inequality, gun control, economic stability, domestic security, international trade, and illegal immigration. We ran a factor analysis on these items, and what emerges is that all the items on the left are perceived to be more stereotypically feminine policy issues, and all the issues on the right are perceived to be more stereotypically masculine policy issues. So I'll show these analyses broken out by participant gender as well. And what we see is that replicating study 1, for male participants, when they were evaluating a male candidate, there was no difference in support, depending on whether they're reading about a stable economy or an unstable economy. But just as in study 1, when male participants were evaluating a female candidate, they showed a decrease in evaluation of her when they read about an unstable economy relative to a stable economy. For female participants, we see a marginal decrease in the evaluation of a male candidate when they perceive the economy to be unstable relative to stable, but that's not a reliable difference, and no difference in support for a female candidate. To examine whether or not this effect was mediated by any of the policy items, we conducted a moderated mediation analysis, which is a lot of boxes and a lot of arrows, so I'll just show you the one that's most important. So what I'm going to show you is the effect for male participants who are evaluating a female candidate. And what we see is that the instability manipulation led to lower evaluations of the female candidate and lower perceptions that she was electable, and that this was mediated through decreased perceptions that she could handle masculine policy issues. So those things like international trade, economic stability, etc. And that was also related to the evaluations in electability. Since then, I've shifted to a developmental lab and done some work with kids. So I got a little bit curious about how kids think about different social roles. And in order to really sort of understand why under manipulations of economic instability, why might we default to perhaps these more gendered understandings of these different social roles? So we looked at what the origins of these gendered beliefs might be. So this is a study with some kids. The focus of this study was looking at kids' explanations for gender roles. So children between 8 and 12 were told about the gender composition of various social roles and then asked to explain why that social role had the particular gender composition that it does. So one example of this might be, most pre-K teachers are women. Why is that? There were 3 male and 3 female stereotypic roles. So the male stereotypic ones were like businessman, and female stereotypic roles were like pre-K teacher. We coded their open explanations as either inherent explanations, so appealing to something about the gender itself, or external, so these are socio-historical factors and things like that. I'll give you a couple examples of what that looks like. Internal and inherent explanation would be something like, because women are good with little kids, or women are better at helping with little kids than men. This was a really complicated external explanation, but this kid said because back in the days of old, women didn't have many job options. It couldn't be firefighters, it could be policemen, so like all they could do was be a teacher. So what I'll show you, so we collapsed across all 6 roles. On the y-axis is the percentage of explanation use. So higher scores indicate that they were more likely to use that sort of explanation. And what you see is this developmental trend where kids start out really using inherent explanations and almost never using external ones. But over time that decreases and they're less likely to use inherent explanations and more likely to use external ones. To be clear, they still do use inherent explanations. That's still higher than the external line. It's just that it's possible that with age, what we learned are all these sort of external factors and layer that on top of the inherent explanations we might have at a younger age. So although people report this sort of near universal support for female candidates running for top political leadership, contextual factors can easily diminish the support in a way that doesn't happen for male candidates. And in particular, what we show is that economic stability reduces support for female candidates in a way that's similar to physical threats. And then some of this newer work, looking at the origin of these beliefs developmentally, suggests that these gender beliefs about social roles may be early developing and appeal to something inherent about the social category itself or the gender itself. And that although we begin to layer additional information on top of it, we can sometimes potentially default back to these early explanations when we're under threat. So I have very little time, but some future directions that we're interested in pursuing are whether or not this fickle support for white female candidates might also apply to racial minority female candidates as well. Whether instability can be construed as something positive, like right now maybe a little instability could be a good thing to shift things up in a different direction. And then developmentally, we're also curious about how children explain atypical members of social roles. So if I say that, oh, this man is a nurse, why do you think that is? What sort of explanations would they give them? So thank you for all of you for listening. Collaborators at Northwestern.